Aloha everyone, it's Jeanette and I am here to go over your Chapter 4 Human Sexuality lecture. We're going to talk about sexual differentiation, which is the process by which our sex organs and genitalia develop in utero, and we're also going to cover some basics of anatomy and physiology. Historically, these topics have been very binary. One of the things I love about this new OER textbook is they are much more inclusive. However, I must say that we don't always have as much information and research and data on gender expansive and sexually expansive identities. And so, although we do our very best to make sure that we're incorporating experiences from those areas, we may not be as comprehensive as we could be in the future, right? So should you be going on to grad school or the university and then grad school, and should you want to pursue a career in this field, that is definitely an area of needed research in the future. So let's talk a little bit about sex differentiation. Sometimes you'll hear me refer to it as sexual differentiation. It's the same thing. The differentiation is referencing the tissue, right, or the physiological changes by which our bodies, our sex organs, adopt a particular sex. Again, we've historically thought of it as binary, where the genitalia and or brain is being masculinized. However, it's important to note that, as we discussed in the safe zone, that even sex is not binary. There are intersex individuals, so we'll talk more about that experience as well. When we talk about sexual differentiation, historically we've thought of it as primarily genetic, driven by the chromosomes, as you're either XX or XY, and that's not actually the case. We know that there's much greater diversity in the human species, in animal species as well. It, however, has not been an area of focus for the research, for the literature, and so we probably haven't captured the diversity that exists historically. But that being said, there are environmental factors that influence this process. Environmental both in the utero, in that uterine experience, as well as after we're born and as we're exposed to both our social environments as well as just the geographic regions in which we live, and then our lived experiences. All of those, both biological, genetical, internal, and external factors influence our chromosomal and genetic development. They influence our gonadal development, our hormonal and hormone receptor sites, and how well those things communicate with one another and function. When we talk about sexual differentiation, it occurs really at 2 points in our life. The first being in utero, prenatal, while we're in a womb, right? And then secondly, it happens during puberty, and that additional second stage and maturation happens. In utero, it typically is triggered through the hormone process. However, it's important to note that all tissue in the uterus, all fetal tissue that is going to grow up to be our gonads, our reproductive structures, our genital structures, it all starts out very neutral. So it can develop either into male, female, or intersex. But left without any kind of, hormonal influence or processing, communication, then it's going to grow up to be female gonadal tissue and genital tissue. And then puberty, we start to, see maturation of those primary sex organs, but the primary focus that's visible to the outside world is the secondary sex characteristics that develop. And that, of course, then can raise concerns for individuals that might have gender expansive identities where their gender may or may not align with their sex assigned at birth. And so now they start to visibly take on an appearance that is socially perceived as being one gender or the other, an opposite of maybe the gender that they identify with. Again, that limitation, because many societies and cultures, including American society, views gender in a very binary perspective as well, not recognizing that there are, in fact, greater diversity options within gender as well. So prenatally, prior to the 10-week period, so it's about 10 to 12 weeks that you start to see sexual differentiation take place. And at this point in time, when you're looking at the fetus in utero, you cannot tell because it's not been differentiated. So you cannot tell. It's interesting how we talk about gender reveals, we talk about, do we know the gender of the baby? Really, we know that as social scientists, we're talking about the sex of the baby. We're talking about, has genitalia emerged that's visible, that tells us what sex we're going to assign to the baby. We're really not talking about gender, because gender is a psychological construction. It's a social construct that reflects our psychological perception of ourselves, and that may or may not align with those physical markers that are associated with sex. So as noted, that tissue that's going to grow into our reproductive organs or into our genitalia is very neutral at this point. So depending upon the hormonal cues that it receives, it will then begin to grow into the different genitalia. And it doesn't always grow into distinctly male or distinctly female or distinct ovaries or distinct testes. Sometimes there are some combinations thereof or ambiguous genitalia that might develop as well. But that being said, looking at the more dimorphic structure that has typically coincided with sex is looking at the structures that would develop and their corresponding structures in the female. So here's the structures that would develop if the individual becomes distinctly male, and then here is the counter organs that would develop should they become distinctly female, or again they can develop as an intersex individual with some combination thereof. That being said, the same tissue that becomes the penis in a distinct male becomes the clitoral head, becomes the penis head, right? The head of the penis, that glans, becomes the clitoral head. The same structure or tissue that becomes the penis shaft also becomes, most people don't recognize that the clitoris is not just a button. The clitoris actually is attached to a much larger internal organ and structure, and that actually is equivalent to what would be the penis shaft in a distinctive male. The foreskin becomes the clitoral head for a distinct female. What would be a testicle that develops in a distinct male would become an ovary in a distinct female. And the scrotum, or the sac that holds the testicles, actually is what would become the labia majora. So that's really important to think about and consider. The tissue may have some degree of consistency between those opposite sexes, and might experience the same types of sensations. And that's why for individuals who undergo sex reassignment surgery or gender confirmation surgery, they do their best to use the existing tissue to create the genital structures that are desired. And those tissues often have similar sensations so that they can try to preserve as much sexual functioning as possible. Now, in uterus, in utero, what happens is the hypothalamus starts to release what we call GRH hormone, and then that is signaling the pituitary gland. So the hypothalamus is this brain structure, and it actually helps to kind of coordinate activities not only in the nervous system and the brain, but also in the endocrine system. The pituitary gland is the master gland of the pituitary system. So in this process, the hypothalamus in the brain area gets stimulated and kind of activates and alerts the pituitary gland to take action and really start to kind of lead the process. The pituitary gland releases LH, luteinizing hormone, and follicle stimulating hormone, or FSH. And then those hormones now are released throughout the blood system, travel throughout the body, and what happens is they start to activate other physiological changes. You will start to see in time the production of testosterone, estrogen, and progesterone. It's important to note that both XX and XY babies and all of those in between all have varying degrees of these hormones flowing through their body. Typically, what we would consider a typical male is going to produce higher levels of testosterone that are going to stimulate a different developmental and differentiation process for the tissue that would grow into typical male, and by typical I mean just from a numerical standpoint, it would most likely develop into male genitalia and reproductive organs. Those that have the higher levels of estrogen and or don't respond to testosterone or process testosterone would trigger that differentiation that would lead to the development more consistent with that of your typical female genitalia and or reproductive organs. And so in that differentiation process, when you identify the specific areas, again, it starts out neutral, right? And you have what can become the genitalia of a male, female, or an intersex individual. Should it develop into a male, then what you're gonna see is greater development in these regions that is going to lead to the penile development. And then should it develop into a female, you're going to see a different type of development. Instead of growing into what would be the shaft of the penis, it's going to differentiate into, again, the clitoral structures that are below that you can't see, and then what develops into the scrotum, the sac surrounding these testes, right? So testes are in here, here's your scrotum. That actually becomes the labia majora. So the labia minora are the inside folds, and the labia majora are the larger outside folds. So that outside skin is more consistent with the scrotum, and then the inside skin actually is more consistent with some of that that tissue that would grow into the penis shaft. Most people don't recognize that we start out exactly the same, right? And it's not until really into that second, but transition from the first to the second trimester that sexual differentiation starts to take place. Now, puberty marks the second phase. It triggers another stage of the development and that sexual maturation, because what happens now is those sex organs start to mature, so they start to grow in size, and they start to have even greater sensitivity than they already do at those earlier stages of life. And that hormone production really starts to prepare the body for reproduction, right? Because ultimately our bodies want to reproduce to continue the survival of our species. So it's a perfectly natural biological impulse and urge and desire, no different than hunger or breathing or thirst, right? Our body naturally is inclined to keep itself alive and reproducing. So all of this centers around preparing the body for reproduction. It's important to note that we have general age ranges that we'll talk about, but puberty varies from person to person. So both the timing of puberty, the sequencing, right? Like we can say what the general sequence or order is that we can expect, but not everybody experiences that way. So I hope in this class you're already recognizing the importance of not being stuck in these very rigid conceptions of this is what happens and this is how it happens. No, we can say this is what typically happens, this is what generally, or the statistical majority, but we certainly don't want to put everybody in any particular box, right? We have to recognize the beauty of diversity and variety in the human experience as sexual creatures and just as human beings overall. So in terms of that hormone cycle, again, that hypothalamus that gonadotropin releasing hormone, that is, it's basically saying, okay, it's time. And when you talk about gonads, we're talking about your sex organs, particularly the testes and the ovaries. So effectively, the hypothalamus starts to activate the endocrine system so those areas can mature and actually start to produce sperm and actually start to mature and release eggs for reproductive purposes. So how it does that is it releases that GnRH, which then activates the pituitary gland to release higher levels of the LH and FSH. And then it actually then now activates those gonads to start actively producing higher levels of testosterone and estrogen. And through that hormone production is now how our sex organs really start to prepare us for reproduction. At about 8 or 9, that luteinizing hormone now becomes detectable through blood work, but there is this negative feedback loop in place where basically our brain is still kind of keeping our body at bay. It's not letting it develop quite yet. That hypothalamus and pituitary gland are still very sensitive to those low levels of androgen and estrogen, and so they hold off on triggering that development process. But in puberty, now that hypothalamus and pituitary start to become more sensitive to the hormones that are going to activate the full sexual maturity and sexual development. And so the gonads themselves become more sensitive. They reach a point where they start to pick up these hormones, and then they start to produce the estrogens and the testosterone at high enough levels where those gonads start to mature and they experience what's called spermatogenesis. So if you look at genesis like creation, so the creation of sperm, so effectively the onset of sperm production, and follicle genesis, which is the creation of really mature follicles, because when you talk about a female fetus, they are born with all the eggs that they're going to ever have throughout their life. So it's really cool to think about that, because my grandmother carried my mother, who carried all the eggs that she was ever going to have, which included me. So I was in my mother's uterus and ovaries, and I was also in my grandmother's uterus. So that's pretty cool to think about. But that being said, those follicles are not going to mature until we go through that pubertal process. And so when we call that first ejaculation of sperm, spermarchy, and that first menstrual cycle, menarche. Some people just say spermarch and menarche, and they don't pronounce the E at the end. I've heard it both ways. So it's up to you. And here's just some responses to those particular hormones. We'll go into that in greater detail. So what are some things that determine when you're going to start that puberty process, or how long it's going to take, or any of that? Age most definitely, we typically see that the age falls within a particular range for any given society. We have seen across societies that in the population that the age of particularly menstruation, that's followed more closely. We have more data on menarche than we do spermarche, and we'll talk a little bit about that. But menarche has actually been starting at younger ages for girls across the globe, not just in the United States, but across the globe, particularly in developed countries where they have better nutrition, and that, of course, is going to support greater health and functioning of the body, and it allows for menses at an earlier age. So back in the 1860s, 17 was about the average age of starting menstrual cycles, and in about 1960, it became just under 13 years of age, where it's kind of remained consistent. Body fat is also another factor beyond just, age, genetics, environment, and I do want to come to the psychological stress. I'll come back to that. But body fat is also a factor. So you often see, particularly females, they might put on weight, and that weight, you might also start to see some breast tissue developing, right? That is necessary. That weight is necessary for the menstrual cycle. Your body needs it to support the menstrual cycle, and the fat itself actually produces leptin, which helps support the menstrual cycle as well. And so when you think about the demand that menstruation, pregnancy, and then breastfeeding demands on the female body, it's pretty amazing. And so that leptin is necessary to ensure that we can actually sustain and support those processes. So you often see young girls who might be prone to eating disorders, or who might be in activities that emphasize leanness, like gymnastics or ballet. They may not have the body fat necessary to support menstruation, so they might have a delayed puberty. So not only can physical and nutrition factors impact our pubertal development, psychological factors matter as well, particularly stress levels. We have research that suggests that young girls who are being sexually abused actually start their menstrual cycle at younger ages than girls who aren't. We have evidence to show that particularly African Americans or Black girls actually here in the U.S. start their period at younger ages, and that may very much be due to the racism that they incur, and the effects of that on their cortisol levels and the stress that their body endures, not just psychologically but physically. Stress impacts us both psychologically, biologically, and physically, right? So it's important to note those things. Here are all the various glands that are part of, again, our endocrine system. So our nervous system is our brain and nerves throughout our brain, spinal cord, and nerves throughout our body. And then our endocrine system are the glands throughout the body. When we're talking about the nervous system, those messages travel through neural impulses, right? But when we're talking about the endocrine system, the primary means of functioning in our endocrine system is hormones. And the hormones are released throughout the blood system, which travels throughout the entire body. So the entire body is affected by our hormone production, including cortisol, which is produced during high levels of stress. So that being said, you can see some of the various hormones that are produced by the glands throughout the endocrine system, and then the effects that they have. And the ones that are most relevant to the pubertal process is our gonads, our testes, and the ovaries in a female. And when you're talking about an intersex individual, they might have testes that are going to start producing testosterone in puberty, but yet their genitalia may reflect that of a female, or their genitalia may be ambiguous. And so for an intersex individual that isn't, doesn't have binary sex organs or genitalia, puberty can actually, in the event that they did not know they were intersex at birth, then puberty can be a time when changes start to happen that are unexpected and surprising, and they might discover their intersex status at the puberty mark as well. So puberty not only helps to mature our sex organs and our genitalia, but it also triggers the development of what we call secondary sex characteristics. So particularly in westernized societies, we see a lot of emphasis placed on our physical appearance, right? And so we largely look at gender as a reflection of our physical appearance. Are they masculine? Are they feminine? Do they have traits that are typical of males or traits that are typical of females? And so some of those traits might be the voice. We typically associate deeper voices with males, and we typically associate the higher pitched voices with females. Interestingly enough, I come from a Native Hawaiian family. My mother and all of my aunties have very deep, rich voices, and I hear those quite often in Kanaka or Native Hawaiian, particularly as I hear them doing their ole, their chants, and their mele, their singing. So it's not uncommon that females in some cultures might actually have deeper voices, and males may actually have higher voices. And you kind of hear that in the mele with male Hawaiian singing as well. Additionally, kind of hair that grows throughout the body, the underarms, pubic hair, chest hair, facial hair, all of those things start to kind of develop during puberty. So that also can be a sign that puberty is happening and or on the horizon. What you see in men is that testosterone helps to stimulate muscle development. And so for the males, when you look at someone in early childhood, their body types are very similar. Whether they're intersex, male, female, you really can't differentiate that. We use other markers, right, that we typically associate with gender. But that being said, once that testosterone production kicks in, now you start to see the male bodies develop differently. And this is where they definitely become stronger, their lung capacity increases, their heart strength and capacity increases, and their bodies become much more muscularly defined and physically stronger. You also see the genitals developing, particularly the penis and the vagina and the uterus start to become larger and much more defined. And then the testes, not testers, sorry about that, they actually will produce sperm, and the ovaries start to mature those follicles and release those follicles for maturation. The one thing that you see in females is breast development. Now, you can have individuals who have been assigned male at birth. They might actually start to develop breasts as well. And unfortunately, that does become something where they're bullied for, right? So think about, as we're studying these physiological changes, these biological changes, I want you to also think about the social and cultural implications. And we do have an air of toxic masculinity in American society that's actually prevalent in most westernized cultures, where more masculine men are perceived as being more desirable, and on the social hierarchy, they definitely have more social status. But that being said, female bodies do start to grow, breasts, and their nipples start to change, right? And now it's a clear differentiation and distinction. Again, individual variations. So breasts may differ in size, penises might differ in size, vaginas might differ in size and shape and color, and all of those. Some penises have curves, some nipples are inverted, some aren't. And so it's really important to understand that even as this development is occurring, there's variation in that developmental process, and then in the outcomes as well. So I want you to always take note of that variety that exists in our human sexuality, including our physical development. And then, I do want to go back, because looking at some of the things that might cause that, genetics and environment, it's really interesting. I just want to go off a little bit on our tangent. So one of the number one predictors of the age at which you're going to start your period is the age at which your mother started her period. One of the biggest predictors of the age at which you're going to experience menopause is the age at which your mother experienced menopause. So there's no doubt there's a genetic influence, right? And most definitely, when I think about particularly my breasts, I very much have the phenotype of my father, who was Caucasian and Jewish and some other things. I actually have the breasts of my mother, and particularly the nipples of my mother. And so that was really important to me. And so when I faced breast cancer and I risked losing my breasts, I don't have a lot that looks Hawaiian. I have my hands, I have my hips, and I have my breasts and my nipples. And so the thought of losing my brown nipples impacted not just my gender identity, right, but my cultural identity. And so, you can look at my aunties and you can see how we actually share certain features based on these secondary sex characteristics. So just something to think about. Like, you might have those same experiences where your genitalia, your sex organs, or your sex characteristics might resemble that of your family members as well. So in terms of the sequencing, the order in which we experience puberty differs between males and females. So you see a more gradual growth in boys, and you have these clear growth spurts in females. Now, males go through a growth spurt too, but they might go through multiple growth spurts over time. You also you see that girls typically will start the pubertal process at a younger age than boys. You will also start to see the first thing that starts to develop is the breast development in females. So again, they might put on some weight. They have some breast development. So there's these clear outward markers at the early stages of puberty that let us know our girls are experiencing puberty, which might trigger conversations in some households, which are critical and important, right? I'll never forget sitting in front of a mirror, watching my body change and going, oh my gosh. And I was very young when I started my period. I was just out of 4th grade. I was a young thing watching my body change into that of a woman fairly quickly. I was always the tallest in my class. I've been 5'8" since I was in 7th grade. Somewhere between that and adulthood, I grew an extra inch, and I'm 5'9". I was 135 pounds, a 34C in 7th grade. and that quickly became a D cup in 8th grade. And so that was a lot. That was huge. And I was in a household where I could talk about sex. I could talk about things about my body with my mom, where she noted my physical changes. I was also, prone to a lot of older men looking at me in very new and different ways. And so that was quite a different experience for me. Now for boys, a lot of the pubertal changes that happen in the early part of the process aren't things that are visibly evident. So boys are going through changes and experiencing things long before it's evident to the outside world. Their testes are growing, their scrotum's changing, they're getting pubic hair. These things are happening in those early years, and we're not typically seeing those things, right? So we're not talking to boys. In some cases, we don't talk to boys at all about the changes that their body's experiencing. Fewer boys share with me, or males share with me, that they actually had a talk. They experience sperm arc alone. They just wake up one day and they ejaculate. They might have friends they can talk about this with. They might have siblings. But by and large, it's often done in silence and sometimes in shame, depending upon the messages that they received in their households, in their cultures, and in society at large. The one physical thing that we start to hear, see, or notice is that voice change. When the larynx starts to grow and those vocal cords start to thicken, that's when we start to know that they're going through puberty. Or if by chance they're prone to acne and the testosterone and hormone production doesn't do well with their skin, that's when we recognize that they're in puberty. And those things can sometimes bring about bullying. And so if we're not talking about these things, then they may not be getting any social and emotional support that's critical to their healthy development. Now, again, they can have a growth spurt that might happen when they're younger, but they continue to grow sometimes well into their 20s. And you don't always see that same type of persistent growth in the females as you do in the males. And that's why you also see males having a higher average height than females. Now, when we're talking about transgender individuals, again, transgender individuals, their gender identity may or may not align with their sex assigned at birth. And so all of these changes can be very distressing, right? When you were female assigned at birth and your body, and you identify as a girl, or as a boy, and your body starts to go through changes that would be considered more feminine changes, and you now start to take on the physical appearance more consistent with that of a girl. When you identify as a boy, that can be very emotionally traumatizing and stressful. It's not uncommon to hear transgender individuals describe themselves as feeling like their body is betraying them, right? And so that's where hormone blockers come in. And for a transgender individual during puberty, it can be very helpful to have medical intervention that helps to block and slow that pubertal process, right? So delaying that puberty and delaying the effects of those hormones gives them greater time to really explore and reconcile their gender identity without all that emotional trauma and stress of those permanent physiological changes. And, I know there's a lot of controversy. I know that this has become very politicized and weaponized in many cases. And they talk about, this is the liberal wing corrupting society. And that is not the case. transgender individuals and gender diversity has existed since the beginning of humankind. And I've shared with you in my culture, in the Filipino culture, in the Native American culture, we have allowed for a non-binary gender identity and expression in our cultures for years. Since the beginning of the history of my culture. And so hormone blockers aren't inherently bad to allow a transgender individual that opportunity to, live a life that is more consistent with their psychological conception of themselves, and then that can support their psychological health and well-being. Now, for some on the opposite end of the argument, they might say, well, we shouldn't be interfering with these biological processes, that they might damage them. Actually, that's not the case. Hormone blockers are 100% reversible. You can stop taking the hormone blockers. You can actually encourage the production of the estrogen and testosterone, and the pubertal process will continue. But blocking it helps to kind of put a roadblock in place, slow it down, give that individual time. And so for the argument that says, well, they're not an adult, they can't make that decision, well, then block the hormones until they're 18 and give them an opportunity to make that decision at the legal age of adulthood, right? But if, unfortunately, you don't block the hormones and their bodies are allowed to develop in a way that may not align with their gender identity, that can cause more psychological distress. So I see hormone blockers as a very powerful tool. I see that the decision to take them or not should be left to the individual and their medical professionals. And I do not see that this is an appropriate decision that should be made in any political arena whatsoever. You have no business making my medical decisions. You shouldn't be deciding what treatment I can have for my breast cancer, and you shouldn't be deciding what treatment I can have in terms of my sex and gender identity. So other things that you might see available for transgender individuals or other interventions for transgender or intersex individuals is surgical interventions. They can remove gonads, they can remove the organs. Again, sometimes for intersex individuals, they may have organs inside that may or may not align with their genitals. And so they can surgically address either one of those areas. They might also do interventions that can remove either just a uterus or ovaries or both, remove testicles, and then those things will definitely impact hormone production. And so whenever you're talking about altering organs or gonads, it is automatically because they are part of, the gonads are part of that endocrine system and that hormone production loop. And so it'll impact those hormones throughout the body. There's also medications that can be prescribed, including hormone replacement therapy, which was originally developed for menopausal symptoms, but it actually can be a useful tool in supporting a transgender or intersex individual that might need to modify their hormones accordingly. And we have to also look at other medications that might impact hormone production. Birth control, narcotics, steroids, all of these things can impact hormone production. And so the side effects could be they impact our sex functioning, our fat distribution, weight gain or weight loss, mood, depression might be a side effect. We might produce, body hair that we didn't have in places before, and other effects to discuss with your doctor, right? Again, whether it's surgical or medical intervention, these are decisions individuals have to make. They have to consider the risks, their own family health history, their own individual health history, and their own overall health and well-being, physical and psychological, and make the decision that's best for them. So we're going to move into talking about some of the anatomical structures. There's different views that you're seeing here. I actually am going to encourage you to look at the link that's referenced in the textbook as well. Most people do not understand their own bodies. And this is one of the beautiful things about exploration and masturbation, getting to know your own body. So, and you also should understand the anatomy of other individuals as well, and the variations, right? So for a typical female anatomy, you're going to have, most definitely the uterus here, the ovaries. So the ovaries is where the follicles are stored, matured. They're released into the fallopian tubes, which then connect to the uterus. So typically an egg is often fertilized in the fallopian tube, and then it travels into the uterus. It implants in the wall of the uterus, and then the vagina is actually what we also call the birth canal. So it's the mechanism by which we actually release that unfertilized cell. So the uterus actually lines itself. It starts to thicken to prepare for that implantation of the fertilized egg. But in the event that it's not fertilized, now all that lining sloughs off and it's released through the vagina. And that is what we call a period or menstruation, right? The cervix is that closing part. So imagine this like a balloon, where the uterus is the balloon, and then you have the round part of the balloon, and then you have the tube part of the cervix. That you often, what you do when you're ready to blow up a balloon is you pull on that neck of the balloon a little bit, and you stretch it out, and you give it some elasticity, and then you blow. And that's actually part of what labor and delivery does. That laboring process is thinning out that cervix. It's opening up and dilating it. So so we call it dilation and effacement, right? The thinning, so it stretches, and the dilation, opening, so a baby can travel through that, be released from the uterus into the vaginal canal. Now, the opposite is true here. So for those of you who may not know, when you're talking about heterosexual intercourse, what happens is the vagina is actually the vessel, right? So that the penis now goes into the vagina, and sperm are released during ejaculation, which then can travel through that cervix up into the uterus. In the event that there is an egg there waiting to be fertilized, it can fertilize the egg, or it can travel into the fallopian tubes, and in the event that an egg is there, it can be fertilized. So the vagina becomes not only a vessel by which the baby can be released, right? It's also an entry point as well for sexual intercourse. Now, if we're talking about same-sex intercourse, right, that that vagina can be stimulated through digital stimulation using fingers or other toys or other objects that the couple might be enjoying, or an individual. And so from the outside standpoint, this is a little bit outside and a little bit outside here, and then a little bit inside. Now, this is what the uterus looks like from the side view. Here you see the cervix, which is that marking that entry point through the vagina. And then closely you see that rectum, right? This is trying to display, which I don't think it does a great job, the labia majora, which is those outside folds, and the labia minora, which is the inside folds. The clitoris right there at the top of those labia minora. And again, that clitoris is not just a button, it actually is a larger organ, so you'll see that in just a second. And then urethra and bladder, which, you have a separate hole above your vaginal opening for your urethra. And so I love this Pussypedia inside your textbook. I'm going to actually encourage you in your learning activity to engage it, to engage some of the other outside resources and share those out with the class. What were your takeaways from the supplemental videos or the supplemental readings, or in this case, a website that it directed you to? So this Pussipedia's 3D interactive pussy, I'm going to encourage you to go look at it because you're going to see this structure is your clitoris. It's not just a button. It's a beautiful, large structure. Remember, that same tissue and sexual differentiation in utero becomes the penile shaft and the penis head. So the button that we think of as our clitoris is just the top, the clitoral head. But it, just like the penis head is attached to the rest of the penis shaft, so is your clitoris. That clitoral head is attached to a much larger structure. So there is what you might think of as the G-spot is still clitoral stimulation. You are just accessing it internally. And so that can be an added source of pleasure and knowledge. So please go onto that website, get the different views, see how it looks, learn what this anatomy looks like, and understand the joys that it brings, but also understand the functioning in terms of reproduction as well. So another complexity or element of female organs and reproduction is the notion of the egg production. So we have ovaries, which are effectively the storage units for the eggs or the follicles, and typically females will have 2 ovaries. And that may or may not always be the case. Some individuals may only develop 1 ovary. And those ovaries may or may not always function in this way, right? But they are the storage house for those, I call them warehouse, for those eggs. Now, they also are the place where those eggs are going to mature and be released. If an egg is fertilized, there's this corpus luteum that develops as well. And so this actually becomes a critical support structure for the egg in the event of fertilization and just, in its journey. So the ovaries not only are warehouses for these eggs, but they also produce those hormones, the estrogens, the progesterone. They also produce testosterone, but in significantly lower levels than seen in testes. And then your corpus luteum is where, it's going to support that maturation process, and it's going to help give that egg the necessary nutrients and resources it needs to sustain itself up until the pregnancy, until the implantation and pregnancy. So the uterus is, it's a muscle, right? It contracts and expands. It actually experiences muscle contractions just like you tighten other areas of your body. That is in fact what labor is during childbirth. It's that contracting. It's pushing the baby down. It's applying pressure to the cervix, similar to how we're stretching out the balloon. It's applying the baby's head, is putting pressure and stretching out that end so it can thin out and open so the baby can pass through. It also is where the egg implants. It's not always fertilized in the uterus. As I mentioned, sometimes it's fertilized in the fallopian tubes, but it does implant there in the uterus, and that grow into a full-term pregnancy, that is where ultimately the fetus is going to develop, and that thick lining that develops every single month facilitates that implantation so that it can support an embryo. The vagina, of course, as I mentioned, is that kind of pathway. It's that that thoroughfare for both the passing of the baby as an exit, as well as the penile insertion or just sexual pleasure. And then the cervix, we've discussed, is that opening. Again, a cervix will open, but it also closes, and so it can be in different states. And then the oviducts, or also known as the fallopian tubes more commonly, and that's really becomes that freeway from the ovary to the uterus, and that is most often where eggs are fertilized. Your exterior structures, including your vulva or those outer folds, and then the clitoris, which we've discussed, has a much larger structure than what we recognized. Sometimes when we talk about the vulva, we often are just talking about it like a vagina, like we use that term interchangeably. A more accurate use of that is really referencing the exterior part of what would be viewed as female genitalia. And that would be more consistent with that of the labia majora in particular, but those exterior structures. Another view of it, so you can see, how the vagina the vulva might open up to expose the vagina, and so you can see all of that, what is visible as the clitoris, but also attached to that larger structure that we've talked about. And then the outer folds, which is our labia majora, and the inner folds, which is our labia minora. Vaginal opening. We do have glands all around that produces our lubrication, and that is often part of the sexual arousal process. And it obviously, when you're inserting anything into any bodily orifice, lubrication is a tool, is a resource, right? But it also is a protective mechanism for the vagina as well. And so in terms of physiology, the hypothalamus sends that GnRH to the pituitary gland, which then produces the LH and the FSH. And then when we talk about male sex hormones, they're producing testosterone pretty steadily, whereas the female sex hormones will change and they vary throughout that menstrual cycle, right? So it's cyclical based, and so sex drive might be cyclical too as a result. But for men, it's pretty constant. It's a pretty kind of normal state of testosterone for them, right? So they would determine what their thresholds are. But that menstrual process is dictated by that hormone cycle that changes and goes through a consistent sequence every 28 days. And then when we're talking about actual, preparation for reproduction, you have the follicular phase that starts at menstruation. So the egg is mature, it's waiting for fertilization. You're releasing that estrogen and progesterone, and you're stimulating the appropriate production from the hypothalamus to activate that pituitary gland. And that now is helping a new egg to mature and be ready for the next cycle. That's going to produce, that's going to cause ovulation, which is when that mature follicle ruptures out of the ovary. And we reference that as an oocyte, which is that unfertilized egg, our gamete. And then that's about day 14. So that's about when you're going to start to see, some shifts in your vaginal lubrication and your fluid. It's now going to get a little bit thicker. Your sex drive might increase, right? Because you're hoping, your body's preparing and hoping and trying to encourage fertilization. And then that luteal phase is, again, you have that follicle is going to collapse. It's going to now produce some progesterone and trigger the hypothalamus and pituitary gland. And then what happens is if there's no sperm and no fertilization, it's going to degrade. And that, of course, now is releasing different hormones that's now triggering menstruation so it can be released, and then the process will start over again. So we talked about puberty and menarche when menstruation first starts. Menopause is on the opposite end of the spectrum later on in life. So this can be in early childhood, middle childhood, adolescence, and this is typically happening in middle adulthood. So this is the cessation. It actually, technically, we don't say a woman is menopausal until she's not had a menstrual cycle for a full year. That period leading up to the cessation of menstruation is what we call perimenopausal. That's typically about a 10-year window. And then after she no longer is menstruating, that's what we call postmenopausal. And I should correct myself because I'm saying she, and that's putting a gender on it, when really we're talking about anybody with a uterus that may or may not identify as a woman, right? And so you can very much have men going through menopause if they have maintained their uterus over their course of their lives. And many intersex individuals and or transgender individuals may elect to maintain a uterus for various reasons. And that may or may not have anything to do with childbirth. So anybody with a uterus may choose to have children or not, and that's up to them. So I do want to be mindful that menopause can apply to individuals who don't always identify as a woman. And they should have access to appropriate health care and support during this process. When we talk about fertility or the likelihood of getting pregnant, that prime time is in the 20s and through about 35. At 35 and beyond, it's considered what medical professionals rudely call a geriatric pregnancy. Interestingly enough, particularly in the US, but we see this in other developed countries as well, individuals are choosing to have children later in life, particularly if they're educated and if they're professionals and have successful careers. So it's not uncommon that you're going to have individuals choosing to have children in their mid to late 30s, but it does pose more risks in terms of chromosomal complications to the child, as well as pregnancy and delivery complications. So important to be aware of that. That being said, individuals at about age 35 have a lower probability of getting pregnant. So this is why I put that notion of a biological clock. It really is, our reproductive system has a peak window. That's not to say that you can't have children that are perfectly healthy and don't have any complications beyond 35, because you can, but the risk increases, right? And in your 40s and 50s, that risk starts to increase even greater exponentially. And so really important to be aware of those risks and to make informed decisions about conception and pregnancy. Menopause typically occurs. That perimenopausal stage often starts in your 40s, and menopause, the average age at which you stop experiencing menstruation is about 50 to 52. Again, the number one predictor is the age at which your mother stopped menstruating. So things that might influence it: smoking might contribute to early menopause. Poor health might contribute to early menopause. My mom did not experience menopause until her late 50s. I would expect the same. However, I don't have a uterus. I still have ovaries, which, had I known about the breast cancer, I would have removed. But I feel the ovulation though. So, and certainly my oncologist monitors my hormone levels as well. Now, in terms of intersex anatomy, it's important to understand that there's huge variations, right? So when we talk about intersex, we're talking about an umbrella term, and there's various sexual differentiation or development that might occur. And so they could have partial elements of genitalia consistent with that of a penis or a vagina. They could have partial elements of the internal structures as well. When you talk about the rates of intersex individuals, about 1 in 1,000 to 1,500 have noticeable intersex anatomy. So typically at the time of birth, there is some ambiguity in those anatomical genital structures, and so consequently they are identified early. However, most intersex individuals don't become apparent until puberty or when they're trying to conceive, and then they're recognizing that there's some challenges. And so those other underlying intersex conditions that become noticeable later on in life happen to about 1 in 66 to 100. Now, most research will lean to 1 in 100 more than the 1 in 66. So there is some variation in the data based on the research that we have. Again, significant variations across individuals. I'm going to encourage you to look up a TED Talk or another resource where you get to hear an intersex individual sharing their story, and there's going to be significant variations. Some have known from a very young age. Some, their parents may have solicited surgical intervention. Some they may not have. Some they may have learned later on in life. And each story is unique. And so take some time to learn those stories. Take some time to really appreciate the diversity that exists, not just in your typical sexual anatomy, but also with intersex individuals and their experiences as well. Sometimes intersex development can be related to the hormones. You might see that the SRY gene may or may not activate. So SRY gene is found on the Y chromosome of an XY embryo, and for whatever reason, the SRY gene may not activate, and so consequently, that fetus doesn't differentiate into a male. As we noted that the genitalia starts out neutral, it might develop into the genitalia consistent with that of a female, but yet they're chromosomally a male, right? And typically we often think of XX as female, but there are other variations of chromosomal combinations. You can have an XO, an XXY, an XYY, an XXX. And so that leads to tremendous variation, right? So not only can it come from chromosomes, but also other genes, where there's 30 different genes involved in sexual differentiation so far that have been identified, right? With the Human Genome Project, we're identifying new genes involved in different things all of the time. Literally, this is like lightning speed changing day by day by day in terms of what we know. We have clearly identified 3 genes on the X chromosome, 1 on the Y chromosome, and the others are all autosomes, but they're on all other chromosomes that exist. And it's important to recognize that all of this is evidence to suggest the complexity and the interactive nature of sexual differentiation. And so why we simplify it into just 2 possibilities is just absurd to me, right? Just like eye color, there's blue, green, brown, but there's so many variations of blue and so many variations of green and so many variations of brown, right? There's brown, red, blonde, but so many variations of those hair colors. The same is true for our sexual variations as well. So here is some intersex anatomy. You have a couple of different scales that might try to categorize or stage or identify the intersex anatomy. Whether that's necessary or not is up for debate in the medical profession. Why do we have to quote unquote stage it or categorize it? Why can't we just recognize that it's just diverse and there's variety? We're going to move on now and talk about male anatomical structures and development. And so again, you have the primary sex organ that we typically think of is the penis, the penile shaft, the penile head. Here you have a testes contained within the sac of the scrotum. And then you also have these epididymis and the vas deferens that's connecting back here to the urethra opening in the urethra, that is connected to a couple of different things, right? First, it connects to right here, which is a Cowper's gland that is involved in producing some of the secretion, right? And here you have the prostate gland, which also is helping to produce some of that lubricant. The seminal vesicle, this is an ejaculatory duct. And then here is the bladder. So all of these fold into the one pathway that is the ureter. So that is the urethra, is actually what helps to become that freeway or that passageway is what I'm going to call it. Okay. And then here you have linking out and describing some of the sphincters involved, different membranes and ligaments that support that prostate and the penis, because it does in fact become a muscle. And so this is involved in erection, right? Pubic bone, which is found in the female as well, and then some of the nearby rectal structures as well. So sperm production, I like to think of the testes as manufacturing plants. Not only are they producing and manufacturing sperm, but they are manufacturing and producing testosterone. So males are not born with all the sperm that they're going to have. Sperm are made on the fly, so to speak, right? In real time. And so the testicles are an important manufacturing plant, and the body temperature is too high. Sperm actually can't survive at our normal body temperature, which is why the testicles descend in the scrotum below the body, because they need to be contained at a different, lower temperature in order to survive. if there's some sort of fertilization challenges, or they're not able to conceive, one of the things the doctor might recommend is they go from briefs to boxers so that they can allow that testicle to stay further away from the body. Sometimes they might even recommend cooling them through ice or other mechanisms. So then there's also specialized cells within the testes that produce the testosterone, right? And that help support the entire reproductive process. And as we saw, the pubertal process. And then the scrotum is that pouch, that outer skin, that sac, which, is crassly referred to as ball sac sometimes. But that tissue is what's equivalent to the labia majora. And then the seminiferous tubes, which are those structures in the testes, and that's actually where the sperm is being produced. And then the epididymis is also in the testes. So we have testis, singular, testes, plural. And here is where they mature and they're stored. So production, sperm production, storage, and maturation. Here's some external scrotum views. This is now going in and seeing one layer, pull the skin back and seeing the muscular view of it and the muscular layer. You do again have this septum. They're two separate divided areas. They're not fully divided, right? There's that septum, but the skin itself is not divided. But you do in fact have two separate testicles in there. And here's the muscles. You will see them go closer to the body when it's cold, further away when it's hot. So even that scrotum and the testes can contract, right? And then going inside and looking into a different view and seeing the ducts and the veins and the cords and some of the nerves and vessels that are involved as well. So moving on, you have your vesicles, which are producing a fluid, an alkaline fluid. So the vagina is a very acidic place, right? It's meant to be acidic because it needs to kill out, bacteria and foreign invaders. Well, it treats sperm like foreign invaders too. And so how the male reproductive structures counter for that is through the production of an alkaline fluid that can neutralize the acidity levels in the vagina when the sperm enters into the vagina. So that fluid is released with the sperm that serves as a protectant of sorts. It also produces its own nutrient source, so it brings its own energy juice as well. So within that ejaculant is also an energy drink for the sperm. So they get the the nutrients that they need. They're swimming. It's like they're freaking running in the Olympics, right? As fast as they can, trying to find that egg. And so that takes a lot of energy. And so the seminal vesicles produce the fluid to give them the nutrients they need for that. You also have the Cowper's glands. That also helps to produce the fluid. Now, remember, it all kind of spills into that urethra. And that's important to note because that's where urine travels, right? And that also is acidic. And so the Cowper's glands help to produce a fluid to neutralize that as well. And it is also important to note that some of this, sometimes you might hear it referred to as pre-cum, but it actually, a little bit of the fluid is released during that arousal period before you actually get to ejaculation. And so there are sperm that live in that fluid. So most definitely it can lead to pregnancy even if you don't ejaculate within a vagina. And so important to note that the pull-out method is not effective for this very reason, right? Also important to note that STIs all live in this fluid and can be exchanged both orally, vaginally, rectally, and anally, I should say, anally. So that's all important to know. And then the prostate gland also then is producing important fluids, but also the prostate gland also helps to kind of support the muscular contractions involved in ejaculation and involved in erection, so that semen can be propelled out of the penis during ejaculation. So it's not uncommon for males that experience prostate cancer that it can impact their penile functioning and their ability to ejaculate. So all, again, things to talk about with your doctor. Also important, just to note, anybody who has, any of these organs, one or more, needs to be seeing a doctor regularly. We often talk about females going to a gynecologist and getting that annual exam. Males need to be doing the same. And so prostates need to be checked. It's often checked rectally. The doctor will insert a finger into the rectum in order to feel the health of the prostate, just like a doctor will insert a finger into the vagina and feel the health of the uterus and the ovaries. Same thing needs to be done. Testes need to be checked regularly. Prostates need to be checked regularly. So we need to kind of normalize regular male checkups as well. So anybody, whether they're intersex and or transgender or have the typical male anatomy and structures, should be getting checked regularly. This is actually diagramming the sperm themselves, and so you can see the different components of a sperm. Sperm are incredibly complex. Again, this is a typical sperm. Sometimes sperms can have two heads. Sometimes they can have multiple tails. And so sperm can have variations just like eggs, right? So important to be mindful of that as well. And then in terms of the transporting of sperm in those vas deferens ducts, we see those tubes that line and carry that sperm from the epididymis where they're produced or where they're stored to now go to the ducts for ejaculation. Those ejaculatory ducts to help propel the sperm, and then the penis we've discussed as what encircles the urethra, right? So the urethra is that tube that goes down the center of the penile shaft. And then this actually is an organ that has all this blood flow, and we'll look at an image in just a second. And so there's both muscular contraction involved, and we saw that muscle in the earlier diagram, as well as the blood flow that supports an erect penis, and that all those changes, my eyes started twitching, all those changes happening during the arousal process. Penises can be circumcised or uncircumcised. So remember we talked about that neutral tissue can become the clitoral hood, or it can become the foreskin for a penis. But for uncircumcised penis, it's almost like a little turtleneck that comes up over the head of the penis. And typically when a penis is erect, you don't know whether a penis is circumcised or uncircumcised, because it's out and about from its turtleneck, right? But when it's not erect, that's when you can see it covers the head of the penis. And so that's when you can determine whether a penis is circumcised or uncircumcised. Now, there can be, lots of debate about whether circumcision is appropriate or not. Typically, in the United States, circumcision happens before a male baby is released from the hospital. There's a little bit of research to show that they do have a small reduction in risk of STIs. Hygiene is typically a little bit easier when they are circumcised, but others suggest that it's more consistent with that of, female circumcision, or some may call it female genital mutilation, and that it really doesn't have a biological or medical necessity. It's historically a very religious and cultural practice, and some consider it male mutilation, where you are submitting someone to an involuntary surgical intervention. And so I'll let you all have that debate in your discussion forum if you opt for that one. And then we see, the urethra is a tube. Let me go and fix that there. The tube that becomes a highway system for not just ejaculant, but also urine. And here, this is just showing you all the many beautiful veins throughout the penis and the blood flow system. And so it is a very critical part of our vascular system, right? Which, when we talk about our vascular system, we're talking about our veins throughout our body, right? Our blood flow throughout our body. And so blood flow very much can affect erectile functioning. And it's important to note that, we definitely know there's so many physical factors that can impact erectile functioning, but psychological factors as well. And so one way that they might test it is, certainly if you have any heart issues or high blood pressure, you're taking any kind of medication that affects your blood circulation, or a condition that affects your blood circulation, that could impact erectile functioning. But one thing they can test, whether, it's physical or psychological, if you have any erectile functioning challenges, you should consult with a doctor. It could be often a sign that there's other issues that need to be addressed. But that being said, if they've eliminated any kind of physical health conditions, or some of the main ones, they can actually put a ring around it during sleeping and seeing if you break it in the middle of sleep, because during REM, you actually get an erection. And if that's the case, the physical functioning of the penis is still functioning fine, and there might be other psychological factors that are involved in that arousal process. So all things to think about. So moving on and talking about transgender anatomy, again, when we're talking about intersex, we're talking about the sex organs and genital structures, and when we're talking about transgender, we're talking about someone's gender identity. And so their psychological conception of themselves. No one can assign gender. Gender is something that is self-assigned, right? We determine our gender, discover our gender as we get older. And quite often, gender identity starts to take shape in early childhood. And even individuals who identify as transgender, they report knowing that something was different than from what people were telling them in their early childhood, 3 to 4 years old. So gender dysphoria is how it's referenced in the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual, as well as in medical manuals. And it is treated very much like a dysphoria, which I kind of struggle with a little bit, but there are some advantages. But gender dysphoria is described as an intense feeling that one's sex assigned at birth, based on genital presentation, does not match the way they feel about themselves. So psychologically, they see themselves in a way that differs from the sex based on the genitalia. So psychologically may not match what their body has been presented as to the world. Now, when we talk about sexual dimorphism, we're talking about that binary developmental process, and where you develop either here or here. And we see that that's less common in the human species. Intersex rates are probably, some of you may have been shocked to read those statistics, right? 1 in 100 for, individuals that don't have an apparent, very physical, obvious genitalia structural difference. 1 in 1,000 for those that do. It's much more common than we realize, so it makes sense that gender also has a tremendous diversity as well. So, the fact that it's called dysphoria instead of diversity, that doesn't sit well with me, but at the same time, I'm glad that it's in the DSM right now where we're at as a society and a culture, because it gives some medical protections and some rights that may not otherwise be there for individuals who identify as transgender. And now, again, there could be a neuro or biological or neurobiological functionings, such as disruptions to that differentiation process that we talked about earlier, where the hormones aren't produced or received, understood by the body or tissue in the typical way, and so variations develop. There could also be hormonal reasons that might explain it. We see that individuals who do get hormone blockers or do have hormone interventions actually report better psychological functioning. So there's tremendous value and benefits to those. We also see that many people report benefits from surgical interventions as well. Bottom surgery is where they're actually doing sexual reassignment surgery and changing the structure of the genitals themselves. Some refer to that as gender confirmation surgery. And then top surgery is mostly applicable to individuals who may have been assigned female at birth, didn't receive hormone blockers, breasts developed, and they need to have those breasts removed. Top surgery is typically more common than bottom surgery. I'm going to say this, it's never appropriate to ask if someone's had surgery. Never. And it's never appropriate to expect someone to have surgery. I would never walk up to any human being, a cisgender, transgender individual, and ask if they have a penis or vagina. Like, I would never walk up to anybody and ask that. Why the fuck do we think we have the right to ask a transgender individual that? That is absurd to me. That is never an appropriate conversation. Their use of hormones, their use of surgical interventions, their use of medical interventions, their identity itself, it's nobody's business. That's their own private information. Respect that privacy. They do not have to have surgery. They do not have to have hormone intervention. And that doesn't in any way make them any less transgender. So we need to respect gender identities. It's a very individual and personal thing. So in terms of some guidance, again, everybody needs to determine the intervention that's appropriate for them. We need to be promoting medical inclusion, medical rights, so that individuals do have access to informed, educated medical providers who are gender inclusive. We also need to get medical providers across the whole realm of the medical field, not just individuals that are specialized in these areas like a urologist or a gynecologist, but actually all medical providers need to be gender inclusive. We need to be mindful that because they do face a very biased medical system, and the medical industrial complex has tremendous barriers and challenges for them. They don't enjoy healthcare privilege. They don't always have access to safe, healthy, inclusive healthcare. They often find themselves in a position where they're educating their healthcare provider. That's a huge burden to carry, right? They also face all kinds of barriers and bias, even within their own families. We see it evident in society as a whole, but individual cultures might also face greater stigma and consequences. So they may not even be able to get the healthcare access that they need. Again, don't ask those personal questions. It's none of your fucking business. but beyond that, just be a decent human being. You would never ask that of anyone else. Don't ask it of individuals that are transgender. And then also be mindful that it's not just man, woman, and transgender. There's also genderqueer, non-binary, agender individuals. And so recognize that just like sexual diversity exists in terms of our sexuality and orientation, just like diversity exists in terms of our sex, diversity exists also in terms of our gender. And then here are some additional resources. Again, you will have the opportunity to review any one of these or an outside resource with your peers as part of your learning activities. So have fun with that. And then just a final note about the medicalization of gender. Again, we oversimplify sex as binary as well as gender as binary. We automatically equate the two as the same thing. We use them interchangeably. They are not. They are separate and distinct, related, but separate and distinct. We need to really appreciate and embrace the complex interactions and diversity that exists, both in sexual differentiation as well as in gender identities. And we kind of need to normalize talking about things, right? We talk about, a very dimorphic, binary perspective as being normal, and we need to really shift that conversation and focus and emphasize the diversity, because all of those things shape our gender schema and what we perceive as normal for gender as well. And that oversimplification and that bias causes a lot of stigma and harm toward others, and so we need to be mindful of those things. So neither sex nor gender is binary, and I want you to move forward into the world with a much greater knowledge and appreciation for the diversity that exists, and appreciate the diversity within your own body, whether that means diversity in the sexual differentiation process, or just the diversity in what a breast looks like, or a penis looks like, or a scrotum looks like. They're all so different, and isn't that beautiful and wonderful? So I'm going to leave you with this. In diversity, there is beauty and there is strength. Diversity supports the survival of our species, and it brings beautiful colors and complexity and richness into the world around us. So whatever yours look like, enjoy. Whatever organs you have, enjoy. Don't carry any shame attached with them. They are all beautiful just as they are. And you choose how you want to enjoy them, how you want to share them with others, and how you want them to be pleasured. Bye-bye. Enjoy.